Hello, welcome to my kitchen. If you've watched any of my videos this year, you probably know that one of my goals is to make a lot more from scratch in this room, from baking to cooking. And one of the things that I want to work on in 2024 is baking bread from scratch. We're just a small family of 3 and we usually use bread for breakfast, mostly toast, whether it be toast and peanut butter with some yogurt and fruit to, my husband really likes just eggs and toast and a good old grilled cheese sandwich every once in a while. We don't really use a lot of bread, but I really love to have like a fresh homemade loaf of bread if I'm making soup or stews or something that, just a nice fresh loaf of warm bread goes perfect with. I know there's a lot of amazing videos up on YouTube and other social media platforms that, a lot of people are sharing their whole journey with sourdough and making a lot of bread from scratch too. I really want to ease into it, and I thought this would be the perfect first video in my bread making series of 2024. So let's get started and see how I make my very first homemade loaf of bread this year. We are starting this journey off with a bread maker. I do have a KitchenAid mixer with a dough hook. I've used it before. I had a Black & Decker bread maker years ago, and then I purchased a new one last year. I wasn't really happy with the machine. I found it wasn't as good a quality. And when I was in a Value Village, I saw this one for $16, and I loved the shape of the loaf pan. I found it would give me more of like a real loaf of bread compared to the other bread makers that I've had. So we're going to get this all washed and cleaned. And if you're not comfortable with buying secondhand, check with a family member before you go out and make a purchase just to see if it's a right fit. They can get a little bit pricey if it's not something that's in your budget. You can download the manual. I did that. It just saved to my phone just to kind of read a little bit more about it. But I went to Google to find a recipe, and this one seemed to have a lot of really good reviews. And it talks a little bit too about the proper way to measure flour whenever you are going to be making bread. It says to aerate it first, and there's a lot of, feedback in the comments of what people did, how it didn't work and all of that. And one of the things I got was that it rose too much. And I know that can happen with bread flour. So I am going to use a mix of bread flour and all-purpose flour. Calls for vegetable oil. I'm also using the bread machine yeast instead of the active yeast just because I had it in my freezer. A little bit of sugar and some salt. Now in the machine here, we're starting off with the water, the oil, the salt, and the sugar down at the bottom. That's usually how you do it in a bread machine. And then I'm not going to aerate my bread. I want to get this quick and easy. I want as little work as possible, and that's the purpose of a bread maker. So I am just kind of not having it fit in there hard and using a knife to really level it out. I'm trying to do it as lightly as possible. So I'm going with a mixture of 2 cups of bread flour and 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. I did bread making a couple of years ago. I think I'll link the video down below. It turned out really good, but it made 2 loaves, and now I'm adding the yeast. And I know in the bread machine, you're not supposed to let the yeast touch the wet ingredients. That's what I've read. So any feedback would be greatly appreciated. I'm just trying to figure out the settings here, and it was right on the front of the bread machine. Usually they have the settings. So I put it on setting 1 and then nothing was happening. So I had to go back to my notes, and it said that some settings, there's a 15-minute delay. So you could kind of tell that it was starting to heat up. So I knew that it was working. And then it did. After 15 minutes it started, and it was really kneading it. But that's one of the things I do find with the bread machine is that I find the dough is a little bit more tough compared to, stuff that I've made in my KitchenAid mixer, doing it by hand. But I just wanted to let the process work out and see how it turned out. So definitely use your oven mitts. And I want to get it out of the machine because I don't want to bake it anymore. I don't want to dry it out. And I got my cutting board here and using my oven mitts. And first thoughts were, I like the shape of it. It kind of looks like a loaf of bread. I use this only has a 2-pound setting. So it's a 2, 2.5, and 3. It definitely said to use the 1.5 pound loaf. But yeah, I have to take the little dough hooks out too. That's part of, using a bread maker. But you could probably take the dough hooks out and then, put the dough back in if you were paying attention. And then I'm just going to go ahead and get a stick of butter that I have out at room temperature. It's salted butter. So I'm just going to kind of rub this because I used the medium setting for the crust, I think it was. And it definitely was very hard. And I find with bread machine, the crust usually is a little bit harder. So first thoughts were, the one end is definitely nicer than the other, but I also know this is a 2-pound bread machine. I like the way that it looks, but it was definitely very, very hard. I also know that my bread flour and my yeast was also not the freshest, and that was okay because I wanted to use up the ingredients and I really wanted to kind of get a feel for the machine. It's sliced very nicely. I used a bread knife. The first slice I did was a little bit thicker, and then the second one I did a little bit thinner. Very nice. It held its shape. I could tell that it was pretty dense, very heavy. I know that the recipe said less dense, so if I probably would have went with all bread flour, it probably would have been a little bit lighter, maybe if I used just regular yeast. So we tasted it. It was really good. The crust was very, very hard, but for my first loaf of bread, I'm happy. You can see where the dough hook was. It wasn't that big of a deal. So I'm just going to go ahead and take the heel and just put it all together and put it in a Ziploc bag. I only want to make one loaf of bread because, like I said, it's only the 3 of us, and this was okay. I think most importantly was I got an idea of the machine. It worked. I like the way that the loaf comes out. And then my husband's like, cinnamon raisin bread? I'm like, yeah, okay. So once again, I did a Google search. I will link it down below. It called for milk and egg and butter at room temperature. I always cut the butter. It used honey instead of sugar. The first one I used, it said 2 tablespoons of sugar. I would definitely use honey. And I also used 2 teaspoons of cinnamon and then my yeast, and I don't have a lot of raisins, but I'm just going to use what I have. Once again, I just want to give this a try, and most importantly, this loaf of bread is going to be used for breakfast the next day. So once again, I put all of the wet ingredients at the bottom, then the flour, and this is a sweet dough. So this is on the 6, and then I also did light instead of the medium. So I wanted to make sure that I did that. So I'm definitely getting the feel of the bread maker, but no big surprise to me. They're all pretty universal, I think, but I did have a Black & Decker one before, so I was pretty familiar with it. There's lots of videos on the internet too if you pick one up. So this one came out. It definitely was not as hard of a crust. It definitely was deformed, but that's okay because it's all about the taste, not necessarily what it looks like. So it was like after 6 o'clock by the time that this came out, and I just wanted to let it sit because we had just eaten dinner. We didn't want to eat anything else. And this was at like before 6 o'clock in the morning. This was a lot nicer. It wasn't as dense. It was very flavorful, and I liked the light crust, and it made perfect toast for breakfast. 2 loaves of bread in my thrifted machine. The second loaf was definitely better than the first. I really just wanted to see if the machine even worked, use up some ingredients that I have. I didn't have a lot of expectations, and I think it was exactly what I wanted to do. The machine works. I have a better idea of using bread flour over the all-purpose flour, using the lighter crust setting than the medium, and I really like the shape of those loaves, and I think over time I'll like kind of tweak some recipes, try a couple of different ones out, see what works for our family. But I just wanted to share this process with you because I know many people get a little bit intimidated by making stuff from scratch, and personally, from my own experience, you learn a lot more from your own mistakes in the kitchen than you do from, any professional chef or any recipes that you read and tips and all of that. You really have to get in there and give it a try yourself and lower the expectation. Don't try to make your very first loaf of bread when you are entertaining that night. Make it on the weekend. If it works out, it works out. If it doesn't, that's okay. I think when you put a little bit more expectation on yourself, that's usually when you are most disappointed. So if you're starting this process, keep it light and easy, and be prepared to make mistakes because it's not going to be perfect. I have perfected my pizza dough, and I remember over the years I've tried a couple of different recipes, a couple of different machines, trying to mix it by hand. Now I do it in my KitchenAid mixer. It takes me 5-10 minutes and I have perfect homemade pizza dough every time. So that is my goal this year, is to perfect my dough making, my bread making. I really want to make homemade tortillas, hamburger and hot dog buns in the summertime, but most importantly, just a nice fresh loaf of bread. And I think that's what I would do, is I would definitely do my bread after dinner in the evening, make it, it's nice and cool, so when we wake up in the morning, we have that nice, fresh, homemade loaf of bread to have some delicious toast with the jam that I made this summer with all of those fresh strawberries and raspberries. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. I will create a playlist saying bread making of 2024, and hopefully you will follow me along on my journey. And for those of you that have been making bread for years, comment down below and let me know, do you prefer using a bread maker, you know, your KitchenAid mixer, or your good old hands? So thanks for watching, everybody, and I look forward to sharing more of this journey in 2024 with trying to make the perfect loaf of bread.